There's a whisper that runs through the soul of every working man, a quiet fear that he's trading his best years for just enough to get by, that he's caught in a current, pulling him steady, slowly, but always in the same direction. And for too long, many of us believe that to change course, you need a full sail and a strong wind, money in your pocket, time on your side. But sometimes, a man finds himself in a dead calm, and the only way to move is to row with what little he has, even if he's already bone dry. He just has to decide to pick up the oar. Floyd was a man who understood currents. 47 years old, a factory worker since he was barely out of high school, his days were measured by the rhythmic clang and hiss of the machines on the assembly line. His face, etched with lines around his eyes and a permanent furrow in his brow, wasn't from frowning, not exactly. It was from squinting at dim lights, from focusing on small, repetitive tasks, from carrying the quiet weight of responsibility that settles on a man's shoulders like dust over years. His hands, calloused and thick, were a testament to honest work, worn smooth in places from gripping tools, scarred in others from the inevitable slips and nicks. They were reliable hands, strong hands, but they were also tired hands, just like the rest of him. You could see the exhaustion in the slight sag of his shoulders, in the way he often kept his gaze fixed on the floor, as if looking up was just another effort he couldn't quite spare, just like the rest of him. You could see the exhaustion in the slight sag of his shoulders, in the way he often kept his gaze fixed on the floor, as if looking up was just another effort he couldn't quite spare. Floyd's world began at 5 a.m., not with a gentle hum, but with the jarring shriek of an alarm clock that sounded less like a wake-up call and more like a warning. He'd slap it quiet, his hand finding the button by muscle memory in the pre-dawn dark. There was no lingering, no stretching, just the practiced swing of his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar squeak of the floorboards, and the cold linoleum beneath his bare feet. Martha, his wife of 25 years, would stir beside him, a soft murmur of concern perhaps, but mostly just the sigh of another day beginning. Coffee was the first order of business, strong and black, brewed while the house still slept. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the only sound the distant rumble of a passing train, the only light the dim glow from the stove hood. Breakfast was usually toast, sometimes a cold piece of leftover something. Then it was into the faded work jeans and the steel-toed boots, the same uniform every day, year in and year out. The drive to the factory was short, a monotonous blur of identical houses and convenience stores. By the time he punched in, the air was already thick with the smell of oil and metal, the machines already roaring their endless symphony. 8 hours, sometimes 10, often 12. The rhythmic press of a lever, the hiss of a hydraulic line, the constant whir of belts and gears. His job was to make sure the widgets moved, that the line never stopped. He was good at it, precise and dependable, a human cog in a much larger, unforgiving machine. It wasn't glorious work, but it was honest, and it paid the bills mostly. Just enough to keep the lights on, the water running, and food on the table for Martha and their kids, Billy and Sarah. Billy was out now, trying to make his own way, but Sarah was still at community college, and those tuition payments, even for community college, stung. And then there were Martha's medical bills, small things at first, then growing, insidious. Every month, the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter seemed to grow higher, heavier. Floyd would go through them, a slow burn starting in his chest, making mental calculations, trying to figure out which necessary evil could be postponed, which expense could be trimmed. The numbers never quite added up, leaving a permanent tightness in his stomach. He didn't talk much about it, not to Martha, not to anyone. What was there to say? It was just the way things were. But underneath the quiet diligence, beneath the gruff exterior and the ever-present fatigue, a different kind of weariness gnawed at Floyd. It was the exhaustion of unlived dreams, of possibilities ignored. He remembered a younger Floyd, a kid with a knack for tinkering, a curiosity about how things worked, a fleeting thought of maybe inventing something, fixing things on a bigger scale than just the factory line. That kid with his bright eyes and quick mind had gotten lost somewhere along the way, buried under mortgages and grocery lists and the relentless demands of survival. He'd never pursued anything for himself, not really. Always, later. Always, when we had more. Always, when things got better. The gap between who he was and who he'd wanted to be had widened into a chasm. He didn't resent his family for it, not exactly, but a quiet, bitter resentment had taken root towards his own choices, his own inaction. He was stuck, a fish in a small pond, bumping against the same invisible walls day after day. The thought of getting ahead, of truly breaking free, felt like a pipe dream, a selfish fantasy he couldn't afford. Investing in himself, learning something new. That was for people with disposable income, for folks who didn't spend their nights staring at a ceiling, calculating how many hours of overtime it would take to cover the next unexpected expense. He was too old, too tired, too broke to start over. Or so he told himself every single day, the words a dull, comforting anesthetic to the quiet fear stirring beneath. He just kept working head down, believing that if he just kept pushing, eventually, something would give. But nothing ever did. The cold logic of a 5 a.m. alarm clock was the relentless conductor of Floyd's life, a piercing brass note in the silent symphony of his working-class suburb. It didn't ring. It buzzed, a low, insistent hum that burrowed into his dreams and yanked him back to the familiar weight of responsibility. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum floor, the chill a sharp reminder that another day was starting whether he felt ready or not. Martha, bless her heart, was usually already up, the gentle hiss of the coffee maker a softer prelude to the day's demands. His morning ritual was a well-oiled machine. Quick shower, the lukewarm water doing little to erase the deeper aches, strong black coffee, and 2 slices of toast eaten in silence at the small kitchen table. Martha would pack his lunch. A sandwich, an apple, maybe a handful of pretzels, always carefully wrapped. A small gesture of love in a life defined by larger sacrifices. He'd grab his lunch pail and his worn canvas jacket, kiss Martha's cheek, the faint smell of soap and sleep clinging to her, and step out into the pre-dawn gloom. The drive to the factory was a blur of familiar turns, the same cracked pavement, the same faint glow of streetlights struggling against the emerging sun. He'd pass the other early birds, ghosts in their own vehicles, all heading to their own posts, their own machines. At the sprawling industrial complex, the air always smelled of oil and metal dust, a scent that had long ago stopped being alien and had simply become the smell of life. Inside, the machinery roared, a cacophony that drowned out thought, leaving only the rhythm of the work. For 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours, Floyd was a pair of hands, a strong back, a cog in a much larger, unforgiving mechanism. He operated the press, stamping out identical parts, thousands of them, day in and day out. The repetitive motion, the deafening clang, the grease under his fingernails. It was all he knew, all he'd done for 25 years. Back home, the light from the living room window would be a welcome beacon. Dinner with Martha and Sarah, a quiet recap of the day, then maybe an hour in his small garden pulling weeds with a methodical patience he rarely found anywhere else. The small, slightly run-down single-story house was his sanctuary, his burden, his legacy. Every chipped paint corner, every leaky faucet, every patch of lawn, he tended to it all. But even within those walls, the quiet hum of worry was constant. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter like unwanted guests. The mortgage, the electricity, Sarah's community college tuition, the ever-present car insurance. And lately, Martha's new medication, an unexpected hit to an already strained budget. He'd stare at the numbers, watch them dance around in his head, trying to make the ends meet, trying to stretch every dollar until it screamed. Sometimes he'd find himself just sitting there, the monthly bank statement spread out, a cold, hard portrait of their existence. It was never enough. Always just enough to get by, never enough to get ahead. In the quiet hours of the night, when Martha was asleep beside him and the house settled into its creaks and whispers, the true weight of it all pressed down. The dreams he'd tucked away, the ambition that had once flickered so brightly in his youth, would sometimes resurface, faint as old photographs. He remembered a younger Floyd, a kid who'd once taken apart his father's old radio and put it back together just to see how it worked. A boy who imagined building something, inventing something, anything beyond the monotonous turn of a factory lathe. That kid, with his spark and his curiosity, had long since been buried under the avalanche of adult responsibility, under the quiet fear of failing his family. He didn't resent Martha, not for a second. He loved her fiercely, and his children, Billy and Sarah, were the sun and moon of his world. But he resented himself, his own passivity, the way he'd allowed the years to slip by, always promising himself he'd do something more but never actually doing it. He felt like a broken record playing the same worn-out tune. The gap between the man he was and the man he'd once hoped to be had become a gaping chasm, wide and deep. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, the bars forged from what-ifs and could-haves, reinforced by the silent mantra. Too old, too tired, too broke. He'd tell himself that investing in himself was a luxury, a selfish indulgence for those who didn't have mouths to feed and a mortgage to pay. But deep down, he knew it was an excuse, a shield against the terrifying prospect of trying and failing. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet resignation, the dull ache of unfulfilled potential. He just kept working, head down, believing that if he just kept pushing, eventually something would give. But nothing ever did. And the thought, a cold serpent, began to coil in his gut. What if it never will? Then the world, as it often does, decided to twist the knife. Martha's cough, at first a minor nuisance, had grown into something more persistent, something that needed doctors, tests, and prescriptions that seemed to bleed them dry with every visit. Her usual vibrant energy dimmed, replaced by a weariness that mirrored his own but without the benefit of a paycheck. Each copay, each specialist referral, chipped away at their already thin reserves, leaving a hollow echo in their bank account. Floyd worked longer, harder, chasing overtime that barely kept their heads above water, all the while watching his wife wither a little more with each new diagnosis. As if fate hadn't already dealt a heavy hand, the announcement came down at the factory, dropped like a lead weight into the already stagnant air of the floor. Layoffs. Not a rumor, not a threat, but a cold, hard fact. They called it restructuring, modernization, words that tasted like ash in Floyd's mouth. He saw men his age and older packing up boxes, their faces etched with a familiar despair. His gut twisted into a knot he couldn't unravel. His current skills, honed over decades, felt suddenly brittle, like old tools about to snap under the weight of a new, unforgiving industry. He was too old to start over from scratch, not without something new to offer, something that proved he wasn't just another cog in a rapidly obsolescing machine. One night, scrolling aimlessly on his phone, avoiding the mounting stack of unopened medical bills on the kitchen table, he stumbled upon an ad. Industrial automation certification. Secure your future. High-demand skills. He scoffed, a bitter, dry sound in the quiet house. Another scam, probably. But a tiny, desperate flicker of curiosity made him click. The program promised better pay, a path forward in a world that seemed determined to leave him behind. Then he saw the price tag. His breath hitched. It was staggering. A month's pay almost for just the first module. For a second, he just stared, paralyzed, the familiar mantra echoing in his mind. Can't afford it, selfish, luxury. They were already broke. Beyond broke, they were in the red. He pulled up the household budget, what was left of it. Every line was essential. Food, gas, Martha's ever-increasing copays, the mortgage that felt like a chokehold. There was nothing left, not a spare dime, not a single corner to cut. Yet the images of his laid-off coworkers, their defeated eyes, flashed in his mind. The terrifying thought of being next, of being utterly useless, adrift with nothing but 47 years of manual labor to show for it. That fear began to eclipse everything else. The fear of being laid off without new skills was far greater, far more paralyzing than the fear of being broke with a chance. He sat there for a long time, the glow of the phone screen illuminating only a fraction of the darkness around him. He could pay for another month of cable, another takeout meal for Sarah when she came home from community college, maybe even finally get those brakes looked at on the old sedan before they gave out completely. Or he could bet it all, everything they didn't have, on this impossible dream. It was a terrifying, gut-wrenching decision, a choice between cutting deep into the meager comforts that remained or surrendering to the inevitable tide of obsolescence. He swallowed hard, a metallic taste in his mouth. He would cut. He would find a way. He had to. That night, 3 a.m. found Floyd wide awake. Martha slept soundly beside him, her breathing a soft, shallow rhythm in the still house. But Floyd's mind was a frantic kaleidoscope of fears and numbers. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and padded to the kitchen. The dim glow of the refrigerator light spilled onto the scarred linoleum, illuminating the wreckage of his thoughts. He wasn't just broke, he was broken. He poured himself a glass of water, the cold liquid doing little to douse the fire raging in his gut. What had his life become? A relentless cycle of bills, work, and exhaustion, with no real progress, no genuine hope. He thought of the factory, the endless drone of machines, the years blurring into one long, gray shift. He told himself he was doing it for his family, a noble sacrifice. But tonight, stripped bare by the terrifying reality of their situation, he saw the lie. He'd also used it as an excuse, a shield against the terrifying prospect of trying and failing, against the responsibility of his own potential. The man who wanted to build, to fix, to create, had become the man who simply endured. That quiet yearning from his youth, the one he'd buried so deep under layers of obligation and fear, felt like it was clawing its way back to the surface, demanding to be heard, demanding an explanation for its neglect. He saw his younger self, full of spark and dreams, shaking his head at the tired, defeated man he'd become. The bitter taste of stale coffee from yesterday's forgotten mug, mixed with the acrid tang of regret, filled his mouth. He was at a crossroads, and one path led to utter despair, to watching his family struggle even more while he stood by helpless. He had to choose. He had to fight. He had to find a way out, even if it meant tearing down everything he thought he knew about what they could and couldn't afford. He had to choose. He had to fight. He had to find a way out, even if it meant tearing down everything he thought he knew about what they could and couldn't afford. The words echoed in the empty kitchen, a self-inflicted vow. He stood there unmoving, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, painting the kitchen in shades of weak gray. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a quiet, bone-deep certainty. It wasn't anger anymore, or even despair. It was just enough. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep living like this, paralyzed by fear, watching his life and his family's future slip through his fingers. The fear of being laid off without new skills, leaving his family vulnerable, suddenly dwarfed the fear of trying and failing, or the terror of being more broke than they already were. It was a terrifying calculus, but the answer was clear. He had to bet on himself, even when every fiber of his being screamed that he couldn't afford the ante. The ad for the Industrial Automation Certification Program, crumpled and forgotten on the counter, suddenly loomed large. It was expensive. An insane amount, really, for a family already scraping by. The first payment alone felt like a punch to the gut. But as the sun finally broke through, casting long shadows across the floor, Floyd picked it up, smoothing the creases with a calloused thumb. This wasn't a luxury. This was a lifeline. Martha stirred in bed when he finally came back, crawling in beside her. He didn't tell her everything then, not the full, brutal weight of his decision. He just held her a little tighter than usual, a silent promise forming in his heart. The next morning, a Saturday, the world felt different. Not brighter, not easier, but sharper, with a terrifying edge of consequence. He went through the house like a general surveying a battlefield, looking for anything that wasn't absolutely essential. Cable TV, a relic from easier times, was the first casualty. He stared at the remote for a long moment, the familiar comfort of mindless background noise, then picked up the phone. The disconnection call was quick, painless, and left a hollow ache in his chest, but he pushed it down. That monthly bill, now gone, was part of the first payment. Next was eating out. A treat they rarely indulged in anyway, but those occasional Friday night pizzas or Sunday diner breakfasts, gone. He'd make sandwiches for work every single day, no matter how tired he was. Martha's slightly grumbling acceptance of this new austerity, knowing only that things were tight, twisted his gut. He was sacrificing their small comforts, and he hated it, but the picture of the layoff notice kept him focused. The hardest cut was the car, that nagging clunk in the suspension, the one he'd been meaning to get fixed. It wasn't critical yet, but it wasn't good. He knew it. But the money for the repair was almost exactly what they needed for the remaining part of that first program payment. He stared at the old sedan in the driveway, its worn paint gleaming under the morning sun. "Just a little longer, old girl," he whispered, patting the hood. "Just a little longer." With a trembling hand, he pulled out his worn debit card. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the online enrollment form staring back at him from the dim glow of the computer screen. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every single dollar was accounted for, scraped together from these cuts, a threadbare tapestry of necessity. This wasn't just money, this was their meager buffer against catastrophe. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and hit submit. The screen flashed, "Payment successful." He felt a strange mixture of relief and raw, unadulterated terror. He'd done it. The point of no return. That night, after a full day of factory overtime and the last-minute errands that always seemed to pile up, Floyd found himself in front of his old desktop, staring at the welcome email from the online program. The clock read 10:47 p.m. His body screamed for rest. His mind was a hazy fog of exhaustion, but he forced himself to click the link. The first module loaded. Introduction to Programmable Logic Controllers. The jargon, the diagrams, the sheer volume of information hit him like a physical blow. His eyes burned. He felt a wave of nausea, a powerful urge to just close the laptop, curl up, and forget this whole insane idea. "What have you done, Floyd? You can't do this." The old fears, the familiar chorus of self-doubt, started to chant. But then he saw Martha's tired face in his mind, Sarah's hopeful eyes talking about community college, Billy's recent struggles to find stable work. He saw the cold, impersonal layoff notice again, felt the pit in his stomach. He wasn't doing this for luxury. He was doing this for survival, not just financial survival, but the survival of hope itself. He took another deep breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the desk. He didn't need to master it tonight. He just needed to start. One page, just one page. He scrolled down, forcing his tired eyes to focus on the text, sounding out unfamiliar words in his head. Then he watched a short introductory video, the instructor's calm voice a soothing drone in the quiet room. It took him nearly 20 minutes to get through it, rereading, replaying. By the time he clicked, "Mark is complete," on that first tiny task, it was almost midnight. His head swam, but a minuscule, fragile seed of something new had taken root. He wasn't broken. Not yet. He had taken the first step. The next night, day 2, was harder. The exhaustion from the factory floor settled deep in his bones, a dull ache that seemed to radiate from his very core. He sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open, and stared blankly at the screen. The words blurred. He read a paragraph 3 times and still couldn't tell you what it said. He felt the familiar weight of self-pity creeping in, whispering, "This is too much, Floyd. You're too old for this. You're too tired." He thought about just going to bed, letting tomorrow worry about tomorrow. But then he remembered the gnawing fear, the fear that had been sharper than any fatigue when he made that first payment. He remembered Martha's quiet concern, the way she hadn't complained when he cut out cable, just looked at him with understanding eyes. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let himself down again. He dragged himself through another short lesson, each click of the mouse feeling like an enormous effort. It was less about learning that night and more about showing up, just showing up. By day 3, the routine or lack thereof started to take its toll. He was waking up earlier, going to bed later. Martha, bless her heart, would sometimes leave a thermos of coffee on the table for him before she went to bed, a silent acknowledgement of his new, grueling schedule. He found himself dozing off at work during his lunch break, startling awake with a jolt of adrenaline. The material was getting denser, the electrical diagrams a tangled mess of lines and symbols that swam before his eyes. He missed a crucial practice quiz, his mind too fogged to concentrate. The automated feedback dinged with a red incorrect, and he felt a flush of shame, a burning frustration that almost made him slam the laptop shut. "This is why you don't try new things, Floyd. You're just not smart enough." The old voices were back, louder now. They were telling him to retreat to the familiar, to the comfort of the struggle he already knew. It was easier to suffer in silence than to try and fail. Day 7 was a Saturday, supposed to be a reprieve, but it felt like another workday without the paycheck. He'd fallen a module behind. The guilt ate at him. He tried to catch up, spent all morning wrestling with logic gates and ladder diagrams, his temples throbbing. Sarah came in, saw him hunched over, brow furrowed. "Ad, you look like you're fighting a bear," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Maybe take a break." He just grunted, waved her off. He couldn't afford a break. Breaks were for people who weren't teetering on the edge. He snapped at Martha later over something small, insignificant, and immediately regretted it, a knot tightening in his gut. He was irritable, short-tempered, and a constant, dull headache was his new companion. He felt like a coiled spring wound too tight, ready to snap. He stared at the screen that night, the words blurring into an indecipherable mess. He felt the weight of that expensive investment, the sacrifices they'd made, pressing down on him. What if it was all for nothing? What if he was just throwing good money after bad, chasing a phantom of security? He closed the laptop, not with a frustrated slam, but with a quiet, defeated click. He just couldn't do it tonight. He walked past Martha sleeping in their bed, a wave of weariness so profound it felt physical washing over him, and collapsed onto the living room couch, too tired to even kick off his work boots. The next morning, waking up with the taste of stale defeat in his mouth, the shame was a bitter bile. He had failed. He had given up. But then, that afternoon, while he was doing the dishes, staring out at his meticulously kept but slightly run-down garden, something shifted. He thought about that layoff notice again, the stark finality of it. He thought about Martha's quiet strength, Sarah's unwavering belief in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He remembered the feeling of that first small click. Mark as complete. The tiny spark of hope that had lit up in his chest. Was he really going to let a single missed night, a couple of frustrated hours, erase all of that? He'd de-worked decades in that factory, lifting heavy steel, pushing through countless aches and pains, dealing with demanding foremen and broken machinery. He was a man who knew how to push. He knew how to grind. This was different, sure, it was mental, not physical, but the principle was the same. You didn't stop because it was hard. You kept going because you had to. He walked back to the kitchen table, opened the laptop. He was behind. He might be utterly exhausted. But he wasn't done. He wouldn't be done until he decided he was, and he hadn't decided that yet. He would just pick up where he left off one more time. By day 14, the fight had become a grim rhythm. He was still tired, perpetually tired, but a different kind of tired. It wasn't the tired that led to despair. It was the tired that came from honest effort, from pushing against a wall and seeing it start to budge. He'd found a system, rough as it was. Coffee black as night at 10 p.m. A small notebook where he scribbled down definitions and drew simplified diagrams. He realized that watching videos alone wasn't enough. He needed to physically interact with the information. He found an online forum where other students, mostly younger, asked questions. He mostly lurked, too shy to post, but reading their struggles and the instructor's answers sometimes clarified a point that had eluded him for days. He was still behind, but he was making progress. Slow, agonizing progress. Martha noticed he was back at the laptop every night. She'd quietly bring him a glass of water or just sit at the other end of the table, reading a book, her presence a silent anchor. He still wanted to quit every single night. The voice of doubt hadn't vanished. It had just learned to shout a little less loud. He was starting to learn its patterns, to recognize its hollow promises of easy relief. He learned to push past it, to acknowledge it, and then dismiss it. He was building calluses on his mind, just like he had on his hands. He was still fighting, but the fight was becoming less terrifying, more familiar. It was just another long shift, really. And Floyd knew how to work a long shift. One evening, roughly 3 weeks into the program, Floyd was wrestling with a particularly stubborn concept, PID controllers. His head throbbed. The screen blurred. He was about to slam the laptop shut and declare himself defeated for the night, just like 100 nights before when something shifted. He reread a paragraph, watched a video for the 5th time, and then without thinking he sketched out the flow on a scrap of paper, a crude drawing of inputs and outputs. And suddenly, like a gate opening in a fog, he saw it. Not just the words, not just the diagrams, but the way the whole system hummed and balanced itself. An involuntary grunt of satisfaction escaped him, a low, guttural sound he hadn't heard himself make in years, certainly not in connection with anything other than lifting a heavy pallet. Martha, who had been engrossed in a novel across the room, looked up. Her brow, usually furrowed with quiet concern when he was at the computer, smoothed out. She saw a flicker in his eyes, a brief, unfamiliar spark. He didn't notice her looking, too lost in the small triumph. He rewatched the video, not out of confusion, but out of a new clarity, nodding to himself. The pieces were starting to connect, forming not just a jumbled pile of facts, but a coherent picture. He still didn't understand everything, not by a long shot, but he knew he could understand it. That knowledge, that quiet certainty, was a strange, powerful new currency. The physical exhaustion was still there, a constant companion, but the mental drag began to lift. He started walking with a slightly different stride at the factory, less like a man carrying the weight of the world, more like a man who knew he was carrying something important, something valuable. He wasn't chatting more, not Floyd, but his eyes seemed to take in more, to linger on the automated machinery with a new kind of curiosity. He'd catch himself sometimes watching the robots on the assembly line, not just as a part of his monotonous day, but as a system, a puzzle he was slowly learning to solve. A month later, the first module of his certification was complete. He passed the final assessment, not with flying colors, but with a solid, hard-won grade. He received a digital badge, a small, glowing icon on his screen that signified he'd climbed a tiny peak. He stared at it for a long moment, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He printed it out, just a simple print on cheap paper, and showed it to Martha. She took it, tracing the digital lines with her finger, a soft smile on her lips. "See, Floyd," she whispered, "you always said you were too old. You always said you couldn't." He just grunted, but it was a grunt of acknowledgement, not defeat. He saw the path now, clearer than before. It was still long, still arduous, but it wasn't invisible anymore. The quiet yearning that had lived inside him, buried under layers of bills and fatigue, started to stir, stretching like a creature emerging from a long hibernation. Weeks turned into months. Floyd hadn't become a new man overnight. That wasn't his way. He was still Floyd, 47, factory worker, hands scarred by decades of honest toil, a man who still worried about the bills, about Martha, about the future. But the resentment, that bitter taste that had soured so many of his days, had begun to recede. It was replaced by a quiet, determined focus. He was still thrifty, still watching every dime, but his outlook had changed fundamentally. The cable never came back. Eating out was still a rare treat. But now, when he sacrificed, it didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like investment. He saw opportunities for learning everywhere. An article in a trade magazine wasn't just fluff anymore. It held insights. A discussion at work about a system upgrade wasn't just noise. It was a chance to listen, to connect what he was learning to the real world. His confidence wasn't a loud, booming thing, but a steady internal hum. He started volunteering for tasks at the factory that involved diagnostics, things he would have shied away from before, always deferring to younger, seemingly more capable colleagues. He still moved with the steady gait of a man who'd seen many long shifts, but his shoulders were a little straighter, his gaze a little more direct. The anxiety about the future hadn't vanished completely, but it was no longer a suffocating blanket. It was a challenge, a problem to be solved, and he was acquiring the tools to solve it. He wasn't just working for a paycheck anymore. He was working to build a future piece by painstaking piece, a future he was actively, deliberately shaping. One Tuesday, the old hydraulic press on line 3 seized up, groaning, wheezing, spitting oil like a dying beast. Everyone stood around, scratching their heads, waiting for the specialist from downtown. But Floyd, he didn't just stand there. He walked over, his eyes tracing the thick cables, the pressure gauges, the logic board. He remembered a diagram from his online course, a troubleshooting flow chart for hydraulic systems. He saw something, a flicker on a diagnostic screen, an error code he'd studied just last week, even practiced simulating in the software. Might be the solenoid valve on the pressure relief, he said quietly, almost to himself, as the plant manager, Mr. Henderson, walked up, face like thunder. Henderson, a man who usually saw Floyd as just another number on the time clock, raised an eyebrow. "You think so, Floyd? We're waiting on Miller to come look at it." Floyd just nodded, already reaching for a wrench. "The pressure's building here but not releasing. Code 734 right there. It points to a stuck solenoid. I could try to cycle it manually, see if it's just jammed." He moved with a quiet competence that wasn't there before. A few minutes later, the press coughed, sputtered, then slowly, hesitantly, rumbled back to life. A cheer went up from the line, and Henderson stood there, his thunder face easing into a look of genuine surprise. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Good work, Floyd, real good work." That wasn't a one-off. Soon, Floyd was the one called when a sensor failed, when a new piece of equipment needed calibrating, when the older guys just threw their hands up. He wasn't loud about it, didn't boast. He just fixed things, and slowly, steadily, his value grew. Martha saw it too. Not just the extra money in the checking account that meant they didn't have to pick and choose which bill to pay this month. She saw the light in his eyes, the way he'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner, not hunched over, exhausted, but with a new textbook or an industry report, his brow furrowed in concentration, but a quiet satisfaction humming beneath it all. He wasn't just reading, he was building. Building himself, building their future. Their talks around the dinner table weren't just about bills and kids anymore. He'd tell her about a new automation process or a challenge he'd solved at work, his voice animated, engaged. The weariness was still there, the deep lines around his eyes, the calloused hands, but the spirit behind them was renewed. He looked like the man she married, only more so. The man she knew he could be, had always yearned to be. When the promotion came, moving him from the floor to a new role as a process control technician, it wasn't a shock. He'd earned it. The pay raise was substantial enough to pay off Martha's lingering medical debts and start a proper savings for Sarah's college. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long finally loosened its grip. It didn't vanish entirely because life still happens, but now he faced it with a different kind of strength, a quiet knowing that he had the tools and the will to adapt, to learn, to overcome. He understood now. Used to think he couldn't afford to learn something new when they were broke. Figured it was a rich man's game, that education was a luxury. But then he realized if he didn't get better, they'd just stay broke. It wasn't about having money to spend on himself. It was about investing in the only thing that could truly make a difference in their financial situation, himself, his skills, his ability to earn. Sometimes you gotta bet on yourself even when you ain't got a dime. That's the only way out, really. That's the only way to build something real. And so Floyd, the factory man, kept learning. He kept building.